is no more. He died just yesterday at the age of 90. Anyway, I was always hearing about him since the late 1980s, when I first used to sort of catch snippets of news. I was at prep school, weren't even allowed to watch the news, but at home see him occasionally. I remember the world was far globalized. We didn't have all these satellite television channels back then. So he was born in 1931 in Klerksdorp, South Africa, and he was black, of course, like most South Africans. He was one of the people, I hope I pronounced that correctly, it's spelled Xosa. Some of these South African indigenous languages have these clicks like in it. I had a South African pupil with a surname as in Nxele, but he found it faintly embarrassing if people pronounce it that way. Just say pronounce it Nxele. So anyway, his parents were both literate, which was unusual for black South Africans in the 1930s. And they were Christians of one of the Protestant denominations. I think it was Methodist. His father, I think, then became headmaster of his school. So he was, I suppose, lower middle class, or maybe just middle class. And there were not that many black South Africans who were middle class. Not that they had a great deal of money, but they had things that a lot of the indigènes did not have. So there was racial discrimination by law in South Africa in the 1930s, not as extensive as it was going to become. And they moved to the outskirts of Johannesburg in the 1940s, and there he got to know Trevor Huddleston. So Trevor Huddleston is a famous Anglican priest who was posted to South Africa, and Huddleston was mostly ministering to black South Africans in some of the most deprived suburbs of Johannesburg, some of which are now called Soweto, as in the southwest townships. So Huddleston was white, and he certainly believed in miscegnation, that was it. Was widely appreciated by his parishioners and seen as being fearless, a social activist, so that he really had to live the gospel. This wasn't something from some dry and dusty tome. It was really pertinent to current day issues, and he must be fearlessly advocating for justice, even when that brought a lot of recrimination and denunciation, even when that was contentious. Other people, that was a bit politicized, but Huddleston, to some extent, he paved the way for Desmond Tutu. So I read how Tutu said one time he was with his mother as a little boy, and they met Trevor Huddleston, and the Reverend Trevor Huddleston took off his hat to Desmond Tutu's mother, and Tutu wrote, "I could not believe my eyes. Here was a white treating a black woman with respect," and he was astonished. So. Now, Desmond Tutu admits that he himself wasn't entirely free of racial prejudice. He'd been brought up to be tugging the forelock to whites who had really almost all the political power, most of the wealth, the education, really everything. And of course, there could be heavy retribution if a black person wasn't sufficiently deferential. At the same time, Desmond Tutu disliked whites who'd invaded and ravaged his homeland. And reduced his people to helot status. Anyway, so he then qualified as a teacher, Desmond Tutu. He was very academically able. He'd learned Afrikaans, and obviously he spoke flawless English. He considered reading medicine. He'd been accepted, was at Witwatersrand University, one of the best ones in South Africa, there in Johannesburg, but his parents didn't have the money, so couldn't afford it. It was just before that universities officially closed to non-white undergraduates. And he met Nelson Mandela about this time. They weren't to meet for another 35 years. So he was teaching for a while. He later went into the church. He became an Anglican. He was ordained. He got married when he was 25. His wife was a Roman Catholic, so he had a Catholic wedding to her. And he went abroad. He studied at King's College London. There were very few black people in the UK in the 1960s. He said racialism was there, but he didn't suffer from himself. And then he was a curate at a church in London in the Golders Green area, and he was administering to entirely white parishioners. Obviously found people were quite distant, a bit frosty, maybe partly because it was black, but also that was the way back then, British Reserve, where he was exuberant. He was an irrepressible extrovert. So he was someone who was full of bounciness, and really could vivify any situation. So he rose up the ranks of the clergy. His sort of inspirer, Huddleston, was shifted by the Church of England. They relocated him, I think, back to the UK in 1956. But Tutu continued this work, and from 1962 onwards, there was a rising tide of violence. Well, even 1960, there was the Sharpeville massacre, and South Africa pulled out of the Commonwealth before it was going to be expelled. And the ANC formed Umkhonto weSizwe to use armed force in order to overthrow white supremacism, because from 1948, South Africa was this white supremacist paradise, and the ideology was of racial separatism. Anyway, so he got promoted to bishop, eventually Archbishop of Cape Town, a city with a white majority at the time. So most of his flock were white. Now, because one of the few things that apartheid did not mandate the separation of people, of races in, was the church. From apartheid's perspective, probably a fatal mistake. And there he could be a standing rebuke to apartheid. He was a black person in charge of whites, because a lot of the clergy below him were white. So making a mockery of this idea of some sort of racial pecking order or keeping people apart. So in churches, people could sit intermingled and all the rest of it. They couldn't marry each other, for instance. So he lived well. This was aimed at him, that he lived in relative luxury, given that he was speaking up for the black community, who mostly were living in dire penury. He said that apartheid was unjust, it was immoral, it was iniquitous, and it had to be done away with forthwith. And while he never advocated for the use of force himself, he said, if it's not abolished promptly, then people are going to abolish it by force. That's a neutral observation. I mean, he was correct. So he spoke up for non-violence. He was very well travelled. He spent some time in Israel and Palestine studying ancient Greek, Hebrew, things like that, advocating for freedom for the Palestinians. He was seen by some as too moderate, some as too radical. Perhaps he got it about right. And so he was a real thorn in the side of the apartheid regime, but they never did him any harm. They got a lot of hate mail from irate racists. And some black people thought he was a bit too cozy with whites. He was letting white supremacists off the hook. He wasn't stern enough with them and things like that. So spoke out on all sorts of issues. Other people said he was too much of a politician. He should have stick to his religious duties. This was a distraction at best, and it was too contentious. Anyway, he got his way, and apartheid was obviously dismantled in the early 1990s. Then he was chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. People were given very frank accounts of the crimes they'd committed, whether on behalf of the apartheid government or of the ANC. And so it was quite unsettling for a lot of people. And the ANC, they took vigorous efforts. Well, they strenuously tried to suppress the parts which were really condemnatory of them, condemned out of their own mouths, when some of their members frankly acknowledged the crimes against humanity they committed. But the ANC was very keen for atrocities committed by the apartheid regime to be publicized. So then he was a fearless truth-teller, castigating African tyrants, and he correctly said that the colonial era was preferable in many ways, despite its injustices, than the rampant genocide that was seen in Rwanda and some other countries. He lambasted Mugabe, and he also excoriated Mobutu in Zaire, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo. So he wanted racial fraternity. He did not believe in racial solidarity. People should mix regardless of race. There should be no ill feeling. So he retired quite some years ago. He published numerous books. So a real force for good in the world, sorely missed, though, don't agree with him on everything. And that was him. And then his name became known as a degree class in the British Isles, a 2-2, a not terribly impressive one. Hello, Mr. Sutherland, from New York City. Well, I've been to your city just twice. I'd really like to revisit. But with COVID, it doesn't look like I'm able to visit anytime soon. Well, thank you for watching. So please subscribe and please donate most liberally to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's GeorgeCallahan79@gmail.com. Merry Christmas.